Welcome to our April meetup. We've got a 3-day architect series. Today is the first day. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for arranging this. She's got Stephen for us as our special guest tonight. So Stephen is Managing Director at Accenture for the Australia and New Zealand region. He's, as far as I know, he's like one of the original certified technical architects. Like, I've known about him forever. I think for a lot of people, he's a role model for being a CTA. So very excited to kick off the architect series with Stephen. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen for some Q&A. I don't see any questions lining up yet in the chat, so I'll just maybe let Stephen start by introducing himself and giving a little bit about his background. And if the questions don't start flooding in, I'll start putting some in there myself. So, thank you,
Well,
Stephen.
the good news is JD, who's on the call, knows I can give really long answers, so it doesn't take too many questions. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Yeah, just to give you a bit more of a background, so my name's Stephen Herod. I've been working in the Salesforce ecosystem since 2010. So it's my 10th year anniversary in 2 months. I've been a certified technical architect since 2012/2013, depending on how you count. Technically, my certificate says 2012, but I know I didn't pass my section retake until early 2013. So I was making it a bit vague. My role, or I've been working in some form of architecture role on and off, I think, going back to when I worked for an insurance company, Zurich Insurance, probably about 14 or so years ago. That was probably the first time I got given a job title that had architect in the title. Although I was probably doing some form of architecture or architecture design well before that in the roles that I was doing. I've given a number of presentations on the subject of the role of the architect in different forums and different places over the years. There was one at Forcelandia a couple of years ago, and there's a recording of that one up on YouTube. I don't know if anybody on the calls had a look at that one, but that goes into a lot of the differences between being a developer and being an architect and sort of my worldview of things. And pivots to that. So, I mean, today, rather than say repeating that presentation, part of it was really to say, this is a Q&A session. I can talk about a bunch of stuff, but if you have questions, there must be a reason you joined this call. That you might want to flick them to me and I'll go into them in more detail. But in the absence of any of those, I'll talk just generally about the role of an architect. I think a lot of what I see a lot of people aspiring to be architects as career ambition, or as a job progression, or as a way of what they want to do or what they want to be. And I think before, it's probably one of those things that, at least in my perception, a lot of people have this perception that somehow it's a destination that you go to. That eventually, you'll do this thing and then you'll get to this destination, and the destination is I am now an architect, right? Whereas realistically, it's all just one long continuum of your existence and your knowledge and your skill set growing. And at some point, you take on the role of doing the work of architecture, or someone gives you that job title, and you're not at the top of a mountain, you're rather just on the slope of another mountain that you will continue to grow along. So that's one thing to understand. It's not a destination, it's more just a point in time that might imply a transition to the kind of work you're doing. The second thing that makes, I think, about being an architect is in some ways it's a change in the way that you think, and you think about the world, or it's a new perspective. I was saying to someone who was a grad, actually, I was interviewing a graduate a couple of days ago, and they were always interested in new things, for instance. And I said, well, after a while, you start to see the same things over and over again. I said, you don't necessarily get to see new things every single time. But what you do get to do is you get to experience those same things from different perspectives, right? And part of being an architect is about really starting to see problems and solutions and technology and other issues from different perspectives. Indeed, if you actually look at some of the more formal frameworks for IT architecture, the idea of perspectives is actually a key part baked into the concept. So you might look at things from a business perspective, or from a systems perspective, or from an integration perspective, or from a data perspective. You might look at things from an enterprise perspective, which is very large and abstract, or you might look at things from a systems perspective, or an application specific perspective, where you're just talking about the minutiae of a particular application. And really, part of the role of the architect is to make sure you're using the right perspective for the right problem that you're dealing with. And with the experience, that's something that you can get to do. So I'll pause for a second and address some of the questions. So we've got a question, do developers make the best architects? That's an interesting question. Unless a developer changes their perspective, then they're probably not going to make a great architect. The technical knowledge associated with the idea of designing good software and building technology, software technology, is certainly a skill set that, particularly when you're doing application architecture, is something that you definitely need to know and be familiar with. Unless you make the pivoting thought, though, you're often just a senior developer with bigger opinions, right? And certainly in some cases, I've seen senior developers with the architect title use that to sort of bludgeon people to death with their opinions about how they should go about doing certain things. One story I'll tell you is an interesting one that came up with my former employer, who he was a gentleman who was very much an architect's architect, and there would be many a day full of esoteric conversations about data models and data design. But his perception of what I should do as an architect and what I thought I should do as an architect, I think, varied wildly. He had a perception that as a software architect, my role was to do detailed software design down to the names of individual classes, right? And that I was supposed to sit in front of my computer with boxes and draw up this class diagram that designed the entire software that we were building without ever having written the software, to just build this Visio diagram of boxes and lines and so forth. And that because I hadn't done that, I'd failed to provide the appropriate direction to the developers. My view was I'd never built an Eclipse-rich client platform application in my life, and that was a level of detail that I was not qualified to provide detail to. And that in doing so, I would be telling a group of people who did actually know how to do it precisely the wrong way to go about doing it. And that my role was to simply set the parameters of the solution, the goals of the solution, and then to really engage in a conversation with the developers that their particular implementation of it fulfilled the goals that I was trying to achieve, right? And what I've probably summed up there is what I view as being the role of an architect. It's to understand the business, it's to understand the problem space, it's to set the guide rails of what you're trying to achieve and the major blocks of the components of the solution, and then to really coach and lead an implementation or a build team through the process of their own elaborated designs and their own elaborated build, and to ensure that they're maintaining, I suppose, fidelity to the vision of what you were trying to achieve with the architecture. And too often you wind up with an architecture that gets set and then a build team that goes and does whatever they want. And the two sort of diverge from each other quite differently. Or you wind up potentially having the architect, providing too much direction, and the build team doesn't have the freedom of action, because they're the ones actually using the software and actually knowing the ins and outs of what does and doesn't work, and have a knowledge that only they know from actually doing the work that will inform their actual design. Now, I don't think I've answered the question, do I think developers make the best architects? I think if you're designing software in a detailed application context, there's no doubt that being a software engineer will help you. It will help you significantly. But there's lots of other forms of architecture. There's business architecture, for instance, and how have you designed the business to solve it. There's systems architecture, infrastructure architecture, or network architecture. There's data architecture. None of these things specifically require you to have been a software engineer. In fact, most people who came up through maybe a data architecture perspective probably came from a database administration perspective background, right, or information systems kind of background. So yeah, if you're building application software, yes, you probably should be been a developer.
Do we want to do the what does a day in life look like?
What does a day in the life of a technical architect look like? Okay. My first day when I joined my first day as a Salesforce architect, when I joined a Salesforce partner here in Australia. And it was the first time I was a newly minted CTA. I'd been given a job as the Salesforce architect, and at the time, this was Cloud Sherpas, Jody, if you remember back in Sydney. I was the architect, and my first day was debugging a production incident involving a misassignment of leads involving Cypher Cloud and a lot of Visualforce. And after many, many hours of investigation, I found out it was because the users were double clicking. No, that wasn't double clicking. They were reloading the page over and over again, and someone had written some code that when you loaded the page, it allocated a lead. So if you loaded the page 3 times and you never did anything with it, it reallocated the lead 3 times, and that's why the leads kept on getting misallocated. So the day in a life that day was a production debug. I can tell you what my day consists of now. It's a lot of oversight. So I get on calls with people and they describe to me what they plan on doing, and I provide feedback and input into what some of the pitfalls or benefits of what their choices might be. I help people make decisions. I try not to make decisions on behalf of people. What I try and do is I try and ask them questions and give them things that they should consider in making their decisions, because it's very hard. Anybody who's certain about an answer probably doesn't have a very complex problem, right? And most problems are complex because of their circumstances that they're in. Should you choose a master detail or a lookup relationship? Well, it depends, doesn't it? And it depends on a bunch of forces. So there's a lot of conversations where I'm asking. I'll get on calls with customers and explain things to them. So I'll explain Salesforce licensing, or I'll explain Salesforce technology, or I explain some aspect of what you would want to do. Yesterday, my job consisted of building basically a Word template that we were going to use for a particular project to sort of really provide a framework. So a lot of what I do is providing structures that we will use or other people will use for describing problems or describing solutions. And in a way that's a lot like storytelling. You know, anybody can write a story, right? But can you write a compelling story? Can you write a story that holds attention or explains things clearly? And so a lot of what you're doing is storytelling, but doing it in a way that's compelling or concise or persuasive. So a lot of that kind of work. From time to time, I do get to actually do some Salesforce and do some configuration or do some investigation. It's usually to get to the bottom of something. I have a healthy cynicism associated with Salesforce documentation, where unless I see it, I don't necessarily believe it. And I'm very tuned to words like considerations, which I always interpret to mean things that may kill you, and stuff like that. So there's a lot of if you're doing work, it's mostly around that. But that's probably an interesting thing to talk about, is that it took me a long time to realize that to not put myself on the critical path associated with actually doing work, because it's a great way for you to slow down a team by putting yourself into something as an architect, and then finding yourself down in the minutiae of a specific problem, as opposed to trying to stay across the entire solution. I liken getting involved in a particular function and building it is a lot like going down a well. So you go down the hole into the dark and you don't hear anything or see anything and you fix your thing, and then you sort of climb back out of the well and look around and go, so what happened? What's been going on? And there's a limited time that you can do that in a project or a program before you start to have missed a few things when you're down the hill.
Did you want to
Cool.
take this next question on the designer certification, if they're more
Yep.
or less technical than developer exams? Didn't you and Simon Goodyear like knock a bunch out within like a 24-hour span anyway?
Yeah, I think I beat Simon, which I did 6 of them in a morning. So are they less or technical than developer exams? I'd say they are. I see people without a software background struggling quite a bit, I think, with the developer 2 certification. It doesn't work, but I see a lot more people being successful with the designer certifications. I mean, I don't think they're necessarily harder intellectually. They just cover areas that are different, right? And, you know, when you're dealing with the identity and access management stuff, it's mostly concepts you got to get your head around, right? It's ideas. And whilst there is some technical component to it, it's more understandable for someone than necessarily the programming aspect of it. So I do think that they're less technical. I would also say that the designer certifications prepare you for being a CTA. Not much at all. They're not halfway towards the process. They're more like 25% of the way towards the process. They're really trying to expand your knowledge, body of knowledge. Here's another question. What are some common challenges and mistakes you see happening very often? People. Just people. I mean, I don't know, where to begin. Technology is really easy, right? Like, it really is. Like, it works or it doesn't work. and you get it working, and it works, and it stays working generally. People are the hardest thing, and most of what you're dealing with as an architect is actually people. And it's understanding the nuances of a particular organization, understanding its politics, understanding its forces, its constraints. Common challenges and mistakes I would probably see is it's always coming back to just the basics, right? You know, I worked with an organization who's in one of Australia's most significant organizations, they sell things, right? They sell stuff. Their entire business is around the logistics of getting in stuff, putting it on shelves, and selling stuff. They did not have a formal specification of how they described stuff in their systems. It was down to one SAP analyst sitting down and writing a 4 or 5 page manifesto that explained how they modeled stuff. And he did it out of a fit of pique, right? Other than that, several thousand people worked in this organization moving the stuff around. But there wasn't actually a description that you could get on a whiteboard that said, so how do you actually describe an article and what's its data model? Everyone would just like look at you blankly. So there's a lot of archaeology associated with organizations' operations that doesn't tend to get written down. That really is the fundamentals of what they do and how they do it. And a lot of those fundamentals, companies don't really have an explicit understanding of. So the first thing I often ask a customer is so what's your definition? You want a single view of customer? Cool. So what's your definition of a customer? And around 6 months later, right, there's a definition that comes out of that might be somewhat towards an agreement of what they consider to be a customer in their systems. So some of the common challenges, I think, is a lot of implicit understanding in the way the businesses work isn't explicitly stated and isn't explicitly understood. And so a lot of the work you're doing is just the basics of explaining how things work from beginning to end inside their organization. So that's another one of the common challenges. Another common challenge is decisions being made not because they're the appropriate technical solution, but because it's a political decision, right? We can't put this responsibility in this system because that system's owned by Barry and Barry doesn't like us, right? That's a thing that happens. So those kind of organizational politics cause issues as well. And yeah, it's just the basics of why are we doing this? What are we doing? Where are we going? Why? What outcome do you want this to be at the end of this process? What are the actual principles that you want to have the system fulfilled? A lot of those things are never explicitly stated and need to be stated. Have I sat on the CTA Review Board? If so, what would you say most people could use more work on during the board exam? I've said 3 things about the CTA Review Board. I have sat on it. I judged it several years back. I haven't judged the more recent incarnations of it. There's 3 things to understand. There's a body of knowledge, right? So that's where the designer exams come in. So there's the body of knowledge you get your head around. There's the time management and the execution skill to do the review board. You've got a lot to get through and you've got a small amount of time to do it. So you need to have a very specific plan for how you take apart a problem and how you manage your time and the artifacts you do to produce it. And the third thing is the experience to be able to weld the first 2 together, right? So what you do tend to find, I think, in people that pass the review board is that whilst there is a percentage of the material that is new to them and that they haven't necessarily practiced it, and I passed and I hadn't done a large data volume solution on Salesforce, not for a number of years until afterwards. But there's a good proportion of the actual content is lived experience. And so when you see it in the exam, you just go, oh yeah, that. Right, and you don't sit there going, oh, should it be this or that, or what should I do, what answer do they want? You just know instinctively, okay, that's what you do, right? And so for me, in my case, it was a lot of things around project delivery, around continuous integration, around requirements gathering. All of those sorts of functions were things that I'd been doing for many, many years before I got into Salesforce. And so I didn't have to think too hard about those bits. What I sat there questioning was, you know, can a partner user approve a workflow and an approval process in a partner community? And the answer is no, they can't. They can start one, but they can't approve one. But that's the kind of thing that I got hung up on. So I think it's really about those things people focus on. I saw someone on a review board back when they were doing hypotheticals, and he would have been a fantastic senior developer. I would have hired him in a heartbeat. But his case study for a CTA review board was building a Visualforce page with a controller. And that's not really architecture. That's software design. And he was working down at the nuts and bolts level when he should have been working up at much higher level of abstraction. Do I find it hard to keep up to date on my technical skills instead of building hands-on? How do you stay up to date on the latest features? Yes, I do. You know, I'll be honest. I've only built one Aura component in my life. I've never built a Lightning Web component. I keep on meaning to, but I've never got around to it. And I certainly wouldn't ever insert myself into a project to write a Lightning Web component. It's really not a good use of my customer or Accenture's money for me to be doing that. So then that would leave me to be timed to do it in my own time. And frankly, as an architect, it's not really that important for me to know precisely how to do it when I'm at the level that I'm working at. What I keep up to date on is probably through the release notes and through social media, and in terms of what I see people talking about, and really what I'm looking for are major movers in terms of capability in Salesforce. So the move from Aura to Lightning Web Components, the Salesforce Shield, those are sort of key elements. Anything to do with the page builder, you know, things that really move the dial on how you would go about designing a solution. So if you look at the old Salesforce in Classic and you look at the new Salesforce in Lightning with a flow, you know, when you take into account platform events and being able to embed Lightning Web Components and flows, and you look at being able to do invocable actions, what you start to see is a lot of technology elements that Salesforce is bringing in that aren't just cool tech. They fundamentally change the way that you might design and architect a Salesforce solution. So whereas what you would have done in the past with Visualforce and a bunch of database triggers, you might now do with a flow, with discrete specific use of Lightning Web Components in particular areas, and platform events to distribute information around the system. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for things that fundamentally change the way that you might go about building the system, as opposed to, hey, cool, you know, now I get full names when I type in a search box, as opposed to, you know, codes or something like that. That's not, I'm not really into the minutiae of the feature product. It's really the essence of, well, okay, what additional capabilities does Salesforce have that now fundamentally change the way that we work? Okay, what's the significance of Salesforce certifications, your experience with certificates, and how employers perceive them? Well, I know as a Salesforce partner, certifications are one of the key metrics Salesforce uses to decide whether you have any capability. And more than once, Salesforce has, you know, been unhappy in terms of an implementation partner because they fail to have sufficient people certified in a product. The people may have many years experience working with that particular feature or capability, but because they didn't have the certification, Salesforce views them as not being valid for doing the work. So from a Salesforce partnership perspective, they're valuable. I view people with high certificate counts fall into two categories. They're either really, really good and they know exactly what they're doing, or they're not really, really good and they don't know what they're doing. There's sort of like two quite distinct groups. And I've interviewed a few people in the latter group where they've had 12, 14 Salesforce certifications, and I've asked them, could you draw me the basic Salesforce data model involving contacts and opportunities? And they've stared at a whiteboard and drawn something that wasn't that. And I've gone and scratched my head and gone, that's really interesting that you've got those certifications, but you don't know how to do that. I think if you have the knowledge, go and do it. It's not a lot of money for most cases. Every employer may pay for it. And if you have the knowledge, it's just a way of noting that you've got the knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, it's a great way to motivate you to learn about the capabilities. But certainly, I mean, when I look at things like CPQ or billing, these are very large areas of knowledge that require very specialist understanding of that problem space. And being certified is only the beginning of that journey. So if I was hiring somebody in those spaces, I'd be looking for lived experience ahead of the certification. But if you're also saying that you've been working with Salesforce for 5 years and you have no Salesforce certifications, I'd be asking you to spend 25 minutes of your life and going and getting one, because shouldn't be that hard if you've been doing it for that long. What else we got here? Is being a developer a prerequisite for being a good architect? I think I touched on that a little bit earlier. I think if you're designing software solutions, as I said, yes, it is a bit of a prerequisite. And I'm talking about, solutions built in code. There are other elements of being an architect that I think you can work around without necessarily having a developer background. And I think that there's plenty of space in a lot of projects and programs for those kinds of people to be doing that kind of work, right? And indeed, some projects would absolutely be better off if there were people doing that kind of work. I'd probably say in the work we do, there's a lower percentage of our projects involve a purely technical expert saving the day. It's a larger chance that things like relationship management or business understanding will be of a more significant influence in the success of that project, right? Because technical knowledge helps you efficiently execute the solution. It doesn't necessarily help you find the problem, which is a different set of skills. Said the architects exams only get you 25% of the way to the CTA. What are some areas of disciplines that are helpful to help you get to the top of the pyramid? I think there's a lot of holistic skill sets I think we should all be looking at. And, I think, I spend a lot of time looking at the things that I'm not very good at and the things that I am good at, and deciding whether I should be better at things, do more of the things that I'm good at and less of the things that I'm not good at, or should I try and address the things that I'm not very good at and try and do better? And I oscillate backwards and forwards between the two quite a lot. I would probably just encourage you to broaden, and this goes for everyone who's in the Salesforce ecosystem, broaden your experience and broaden your knowledge. Salesforce, and particularly Trailhead.com, is not the be-all and end-all of human knowledge. It really isn't, right? There's plenty of books out there. There's plenty of blogs out there. There's plenty of technology information and business information out there that does not come out of Salesforce. And many of it is deeper and richer than anything Salesforce provides. And I would encourage you to read broadly on topics from usability, systems thinking, project design, agile methodologies. I mean, you should read the book on Scrum by Jeff Sutherland, and you'll understand why Scrum is probably a terrible idea for a great many projects. But if you were building a product, go for it. But most people aren't building products, so so go broaden yourself. Treat this as a professional, as a mechanism by which you just become that Renaissance man, I think, idea of being a little bit good at a lot of different things. Does my comment about high certificate accounts apply to trailhead badges also? I don't know. I think if you've got the time, I don't. I know, there's several people with trailhead badge counts into the 700s. I use trailhead very discreetly to get an easy to understand introduction into new Salesforce technologies, but I would learn far more from reading the documentation. Because Trailhead is very good at the happy path and not very good at the actual, like, so what happens when I do that, and does that still, okay, that's not going to work. So yeah, I mean, learn because you're trying to learn, not because you're trying to get your badge count up. What else? Can someone move from being a technical architect in one CRM to becoming a Salesforce certified architect in a short period of time? Yes, my answer is yes, probably. I mean, a lot of the concepts. When I got started in CRM, I joked that I didn't know how to spell CRM. I didn't know what a customer relationship management system did. I'd never come into contact with one. My first attempt to learn Salesforce as a Salesforce developer was to crack open NetBeans and start writing Java code against the Salesforce APIs. It was about 3 weeks into doing that I read the Salesforce study guide for being a developer and realized that it had nothing to do with that at all, and that maybe I should go and log into Salesforce and click around the system. So I think there's a lot of concepts in CRM, and it's certainly a lot of people in our organization have come from a Siebel background, have mainly come into Salesforce with a sense of relief. It's like they've taken off a tight pair of pants and everything's a little bit more comfortable. So they've generally found that it transferable, the concepts, and I think that's valuable. I'm always encouraging people who come in from other domains and other areas to bring their point of view into the technology, because if all you know is Salesforce, then everything is a Salesforce solution, and some things aren't. So it's a helpful thing. In your experience as an architect leading a project or one of several resources being led by a project or a program manager for projects you're on, what the people structure look like? Okay, it will be a terribly run project if an architect is running the project. You really like, they are like, delivery leads at my organization are people I don't know how they do that job, right? There's budget and schedule and client politics and status reporting and all those things that are an entire job and a profession in and of itself. Architecture is just one small narrow part of the entire spectrum required to deliver a program. It's important. If you lack it, you might not get the outcome you want. But I mean, who's here's worked on a project with an excessive number of architects? Anybody? Right? I mean, a collective group of architects should be called an indecision, right? Architects are very good at sitting around in a circle, having long meetings, talking about, wow, but is blue really blue? Maybe we should think about blue a bit more. I think someone should go write a paper about blue. And that's the kind of stuff that happens with architects. And it is part of that worldview of changing your point of view. But God, we can take up some time. And that's an example of people who are too detached from the delivery aspect of it, right? They're not actually feeling the consequences of their choices. So they'll say, oh yes, well, you know, you should use a Azure blue because it's the only blue that you shouldn't ever use. And someone will go, well, actually we're, you know, painting the inside of a roof cavity and that's not really a good color. But, you know, that's a kind of bizarre. I may have just bought a house. So I'm thinking a lot in house metaphors at the moment. So there's just don't do that. What does the project structure look like? It would typically look like a dedicated delivery lead, potentially supported by a project management office to help run the project. You've typically got stream leads who are running each particular independent stream. That person is generally a mini delivery lead or scrum master. And then they're supported by functional or solution architects in a shared role across the program who are providing either technical design guidance or overall solution design guidance, okay? And particularly at Accenture, we make a strong distinction between a solution architect and a technical architect. So a solution architect is actually looking at, in our world, the overall project in terms of its structure and delivery, and the technical architect is just dealing with the technology portion of it. As a TA, most of the time we'll be busy in design and solution and left core development from day-to-day activity. How do you balance being a TA role and keeping your hands dirty doing coding? My advice is, if you're going to do coding, as I said, don't put yourself on the critical path. Do it as proof of concepts, do it as extra credit, do it as things that are sort of off the path. You're just going out there to do a thing and come back, but don't put yourself into a big body of work unless you plan on dedicating yourself to it and giving up guidance to other people. There was a thing many years ago that Google was very much bragging that their managers had 40 or 50 reports and they still did hands-on coding. And to this day, I still don't understand how the hell that could possibly be true. I mean, who has managed 40 or 50 people? I mean, you spend most of that time dealing with people. There's no time to actually be writing code in any meaningful way. So it's a strange thing. But you'd have to be strategic, and you have to ask yourself, am I doing this coding for my ego because I want to, or am I doing it because I'm finding something out that will help the project or help the program? Otherwise, you might be better off doing it in your evenings on the weekends. Right? I want to keep doing that. Any differences have I noticed between working for clients in the US and the ANZ, or differences in industries on the different regions? Harder to say with the US. I mean, if I say a joke here, but I mean, most Americans are so gosh darn upbeat, right? You're so just happy and gung-ho. That seems to be a thing that Americans are, where Australians are a little bit more sardonic, I think, and we probably swear a bit more. Whenever there's a Salesforce World Tour and the American execs come down from Salesforce to talk about how excited they are and they can feel the energy in the room, there's typically about 4,000 Australians with their arms crossed going. Like, there's dead silence, right? So that's one thing. And certainly, I mean, if you're giving a presentation to a group of Australians, it'll be totally dead in the room, and then afterwards they'll come and say, oh, that was really good. But during the meeting, you think you're just dying, really. Difference between industries in different regions. Definitely differences in industries and the way people behave in different industries. The first thing you do when I walk into a company or walk into an organization is I'm looking at everything from the building, from the building to the people to the meeting rooms, their signage, how the people are dressed, what their desks are like, and I'm making judgments or assessments as to what kind of organization they might be in terms of what they're projecting and what they would like in a customer. I'm not always right, but it's certainly something you have to take into account when you're going to solutions. I mean, one client, you'll say, you know, white is white and black is black, and they'll go, cool. And that was the end of the decision-making process. And another client, you'll say white is white, black is black, and they'll say, oh, we're going to need a paper about that. And you'll write a 27-page document explaining two colors and where they fit into the spectrum of things, and then they'll file it away, right? And it's down to the individual organization.
How are you doing for time, Stephen?
I'm
Do you have
well,
time to get through all the
I
questions?
told you I gave really long answers. I told you I gave you really long answers.
Yeah, we just want to be respectful since it's
no. I'm actually good. My calendar next meeting's 11:30, so we've got 3 more
Awesome.
hours. I'll speed up. Do you sleep good when a new client project, or is it working 24/7 with no sleeping? I've long since learned that that life is a marathon and not a sprint. And certainly when you're working with very large clients, heroic efforts at points in time have to be very, very strategically timed, because if you do it at the wrong time, it becomes your working life. If you do it at the right time, you could potentially avert a very specific disaster. That may be the case, but most of the time you want to set a case. Most projects and most customers, you know, once they get a bus schedule, they know when the next bus is arriving. They're pretty comfortable, right? What they want is predictability. You know, every Monday a thing happens. There's projects that I've had where I've come in and I've actually slowed it down. We were doing 2 releases to UAT a day, and I was like, no, we're not. We're doing that once a week. And that's and anything faster than that you can't deal with. So why are you asking for it to be twice a day? And that habit of just slowing things down and providing this just regular beat of a thing that will always happen, it's like a metronome. It just settles everyone down. So yeah, try and set a sustainable work pace. Do I get requests from developers to troubleshoot their issues? Yes, not as much as I used to. My least favorite ones are when the person would send me a request and I would type that request into Google and I would find the first result in Google, and then that was the answer, and I would send it back to them. And when I was being particularly unpleasant, and pissed off, I might put that into let me Google that for you. And send them the link to let me Google for that. There's been times where I've done that, but then deleted it before I sent it because I knew I was just being an ass. But that was a reflection of the stress I was under, not my general feelings towards them. So yeah, I do get trouble with developer issues. I don't get the specifics. My last issue to troubleshoot was actually last Thursday after I was moving house. And I got a distress call from a project going live where I had to figure out how to do communities with Cloudflare in front of communities. And so I was reading the Salesforce documentation and using my knowledge of HTTP proxying and DNS to figure out the right incantations to put in the right boxes in Salesforce so that they knew what they were doing. And so that was one of those things where I got called on. And that was when I went back to earlier in the conversation, I said, read broadly. You know, I studied HTTP as a standard back at university in 1994, right? So an understanding of HTTP and an understanding of DNS are 2 things that you won't come across typically in Salesforce. But when you're trying to troubleshoot that issue, it's a body of knowledge you might rely on. So that's where reading outside of Salesforce can help you out. So yeah, I do get issues from time to time, but I try and make sure that if a developer's coming to me with a problem, now it's more around a general design concept than an actual specific technical problem. What's the threshold to bring in a CTA on a project, and what's the level of complexity if you bring one? The threshold of bringing a CTA in on a project is, can the client afford one? There's certainly there's not always a relationship between the complexity of a project and the level of technical skill brought in. Sometimes a customer doesn't understand the level of complexity that's in their project. Sometimes they don't believe that there's a level of complexity in their project. So it's a case of that. As far as getting a full-time CTA is concerned, it's usually driven by either a customer request that they want one, which is often filled by Salesforce, which is often started by them suggesting their own professional services, or it's come through, well, that's the primary one for the customer arena. Or we believe, in our case, it's a competitive advantage on a deal that a CTA that this type of problem would be doing it. The level of complexity is difficult. I'd typically be saying, you know, is it being asked, are you asking Salesforce to do something that Salesforce should probably not do, or is uncommonly asked to do? Anything to do with CPQ, particularly in a consumer basis, is probably requires a CTA. Or is there a lot of integration? There's got to be some facet of the solution that is a more complicated problem. And worst case, a CTA is providing some form of oversight for the technical governance on the project. So yeah. Out of questions.
Yeah, that was great. I think since they're slowing down, it's probably a good time to kind of transition to the next portion. Really want to thank you for your time. We, like you said, we couldn't afford you if we had to pay for your time, but really thankful for you donating your time. We were going to try just to unmute everybody and kind of let everybody say thank you and give a clap and maybe say goodbye to each other. It'll be a bit of an experiment with all these people, but we're going to see how it goes. So I'll be the first to say thank you. And
thank you, Steve.
Unmute everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Changing
Bye.
wants after
Thank you.
have like what is comment 25 now we're on. This isn't the